My name is Amalinda Lopez, and at 34, I finally bought something that belonged to no one but me. A stilted sea glass green beach house on the Galveston coast in Texas. 3 bedrooms, a wraparound deck, and more peace than I had ever known in my entire life. My first Tuesday there, the phone rang, and it was my mother. She did not say hello. She said, "We sold the house. We are moving into your place tomorrow. Your father already decided. Mateo and Jessica are coming too." I stood on my own deck, the salt wind hitting my face, and held my breath. Then she added the part she always adds when she wants to assert control. "Have the guest rooms cleared out. Your brother needs the room with the ocean view for his home office. Do not make this difficult." My hands shook, but I smiled because she had made one critical miscalculation, and she did not know it yet. By the time their moving truck rolled up my driveway the next morning, I had already built a legal trap they would never see coming. Welcome back to QT Told Stories, where ordinary women stop apologizing and start setting the record straight. If you have ever had a family that takes more than it gives, you are in the right place. Drop a comment with your age and your city, hit subscribe, and stay with me. What I found in the county records that morning is something I will never forget. For 10 years, I worked as a supply chain logistics coordinator for the Port of Galveston. I learned to track liabilities across oceans and keep my voice level. Coordinators do not panic. We audit. We find the discrepancy in the manifest and we lock it down. I was good at it. I was good at it for so long that I stopped noticing how much my own family treated me like a warehouse they could raid whenever they ran low on funds. 2 years ago, my Aunt Rosa passed away and left me her life savings with one handwritten stipulation: buy a door they cannot unhinge. She knew my parents. She knew my brother Mateo was the golden child, a man who never faced a consequence our parents did not pay for. She knew his wife Jessica treated our family like a personal bank account. So I followed Rosa's instructions to the letter. I did not buy the house in my own name. I formed a limited liability company called Rosas Retreat, LLC. I purchased the property under the corporate entity and secured a commercial short-term lodging license from the city. On paper, my home was a commercial business, and I was simply its registered property manager. I kept my mouth shut about the paperwork. In my family, a boundary was treated as an act of war. So I built my fortress in the filing cabinets where they would never look. When my mother ended the call that Tuesday morning, the silence of the beach house settled back in around me. I walked inside, slid the glass patio door shut, and locked it. I poured my fresh coffee straight down the sink. I did not have time for breakfast. The math of her announcement was structurally unsound. Hector Lopez was a man who measured his self-worth by the pristine square footage of his Houston suburb home. He manicured his front lawn with a ruler. He boasted about his fixed-rate mortgage at every holiday dinner, making sure everyone at the table knew how financially secure he was. Men like my father do not spontaneously sell their primary asset on a random Tuesday and move into their daughter's guest room, unless the foundation has already collapsed. Furthermore, Mateo and Jessica detested the coast. Jessica once called the island a swamp of unfiltered humidity. For them to abandon their luxury apartment and tag along meant they no longer had a choice in their own zip code. Something had broken. I opened my laptop on the kitchen island and bypassed my personal email. I navigated straight to the Harris County Appraisal District website and opened a second tab for the County Clerk Public Records portal. I typed in my parents' address. The search wheel spun for 3 seconds before the deed history populated the screen. The property had indeed changed hands. A warranty deed had been recorded just last Thursday. They had sold the Houston house to a cash buyer investment firm for a price 20% below market value. You do not take a 20% loss on a paid-off home unless the bank is breathing down your neck. That was a liquidation sale. It was a panic move. But the detail that made the hair on my arms stand up was not the low sale price. It was the routing of the escrow disbursement attached to the public filing. When you sell a home, you own outright. The title company wires the funds directly to your personal bank account. The routing number on this public disbursement receipt did not point to a joint checking account for Hector and Carmen Lopez. I copied the routing and destination information and ran it through a basic federal directory. The money from my parents' house had bypassed them entirely. It had been wired directly into the holding account of a federal corporate bankruptcy court in the Southern District of Texas. I sat back on my bar stool and stared at the glowing screen. The picture snapped into sharp focus. They were not coming for a vacation. They were coming to survive a financial crater. Based on the fact that Mateo was riding in the same car, it was his crater. My brother had tried to launch a tech startup 2 years ago. My parents had bankrolled his ambition because Mateo was the son, the legacy, the future. They had just sold their home to bail him out of a catastrophic corporate failure, leaving themselves destitute. Now they were driving down the coast to establish residency under my roof, claim familial rights, and bleed my asset dry to rebuild his life. They thought I was still the compliant girl who would give up her bedroom to make Mateo comfortable. They did not realize I had spent the last decade auditing supply chains and reading federal maritime law. I had exactly 24 hours to prepare a welcome they would never forget. I did not panic. Panic is a luxury for people who do not know how to read a ledger. I treated my family like a corrupted shipping manifest. I sat at my kitchen island and spent the next 6 hours tracing the financial wreckage they had tried to bury. Mateo had launched a logistics software startup 3 years ago. He called it an industry disruptor. I called it a vaporware pitch built on borrowed confidence. My brother possessed the kind of charisma that works perfectly in boardrooms and fails miserably in actual execution. He secured 2 rounds of seed funding based on our father's co-signature and his own expensive suits. He burned through every cent within 18 months on leased office space, corporate retreats, and a lifestyle he had not earned. The public court filings painted a bleak picture. When the venture capital dried up, Mateo took out predatory business loans. When those defaulted, the creditors came for the guarantors, Hector and Carmen Lopez. My parents had sold their paid-off Houston home, the very foundation of my father's pride, to satisfy a court-ordered liquidation. They had sacrificed their entire net worth to keep their son out of a civil fraud courtroom. They were left destitute. The second overlapping conflict hit me with the clarity of a dropped glass. My mother had framed their arrival as a temporary family visit. That was a lie. They had no home to return to. They were coming to permanently occupy my asset, establish residency, and rebuild Mateo's life using my credit and my equity. They intended to bleed me dry. I picked up my phone and dialed Sylvia Garza. Sylvia is a corporate real estate attorney based in Houston. She does not mince words, and she does not deal in sentimentality. I hired her 2 years ago to structure the purchase of my beach house, precisely because she views family disputes through the lens of liability. I explained the situation to her in plain terms: the sale of the Houston house, the bankruptcy wire transfer, the phone call from my mother mandating my guest rooms for Mateo. I asked Sylvia to confirm the structural integrity of my legal firewall. She pulled the file for Rosas Retreat, LLC, while I waited on the line. Sylvia confirmed what we had built. The Galveston property was deeded exclusively to the corporate entity. I was listed as the registered agent and property manager. We had secured and maintained an active short-term rental license with the city. This detail was crucial. Under Texas law, there is a sharp distinction between a residential tenant and a lodging guest. If my parents moved into a residential home, they could establish tenancy within days. Evicting a tenant requires a lengthy court process, notice periods, and months of legal maneuvering. But a lodging guest does not have tenant rights. They are subject to theft of service laws. Sylvia advised me to treat them exactly like hostile hotel guests. No residential mail delivery, no utility accounts in their names, no structural modifications. I hung up the phone and started moving. I had 18 hours left. If my house was legally a hotel, it needed to look like one. I walked into the guest room with the ocean view, the room my mother had specifically requisitioned for my brother. It was painted a soft blue and held a vintage writing desk I had restored myself. I carried the desk out to the garage. I stripped the coastal quilt from the bed and replaced it with stark white hotel-grade sheets. I removed the framed photographs, the decorative lamps, and the woven rugs. I left a bare mattress, a generic nightstand, and empty closets. I did the same to the second guest room. I stripped away every trace of comfort, warmth, and personality. I boxed up anything sentimental and locked it inside my primary bedroom. Next, I addressed the public spaces. When you run a lodging facility, you are legally permitted to monitor the common areas for liability purposes. I drove to the local hardware store and purchased 4 retail-grade security cameras. I did not buy the discrete residential models. I bought the prominent black dome cameras used in warehouses. I installed one in the entryway, one over the kitchen island, one facing the living room, and one covering the back deck. I wired them directly to a separate encrypted network. I positioned them so they were impossible to miss. They were not hidden traps. They were clear, undeniable boundaries. I wanted my parents to walk through the front door and immediately understand they were being watched. With the physical space secured, I returned to my laptop to prepare the paperwork. In logistics, documentation is the only thing that separates a smooth transit from a federal seizure. I printed the articles of incorporation for Rosas Retreat, LLC. I printed the lodging license issued by the City of Galveston. I drafted a standard liability waiver for the property. Finally, I printed the public escrow disbursement record from their home sale, the one proving the money went to bankruptcy court. I placed every single sheet into a thick manila folder. I set the folder on the kitchen counter, perfectly aligned with the edge of the granite. I sat on my deck as the sun went down over the Gulf. I thought about my Aunt Rosa. She was the only person who ever looked at our family and saw the imbalance. She watched my parents buy Mateo a new car for his high school graduation while handing me a bus pass. She watched them pay for his out-of-state tuition while I worked double shifts to afford night school. Rosa never argued with them. She just quietly adjusted her own will. She left me her money because she knew I was the only one who would not hand it over to Mateo. She told me to buy a door they could not unhinge, and I had spent the entire evening reinforcing the hinges. I did not sleep much that night. I listened to the waves hitting the pilings under the house. I mentally reviewed the state statutes. I checked the camera feeds on my phone. The lenses glowed with a faint red light in the dark living room. My mother expected to arrive and find a daughter eager to accommodate her demands. She expected to walk in, unpack her bags, and slowly take over the space, inch by inch, the way she had taken over every other aspect of my life. She expected a home. I had prepared a fortress. The sun came up over the water, pale and yellow. At 8 a.m, the rumble of a diesel engine shook the wooden planks of my driveway. I walked to the front window and looked through the blinds. It was not a small moving van. It was a 50-foot freight truck. The air brakes hissed loudly as it parked across my front lawn. The passenger door opened, and Jessica stepped out. She was wearing oversized sunglasses and holding a clipboard. She did not walk toward the front door to say hello. She turned to the cargo bay and started barking orders at 3 hired movers. The men lowered the ramp and began carrying out the pieces of a heavy oak master bedroom suite. They were not bringing suitcases for a weekend stay. They were bringing their own furniture to claim my house permanently. The diesel engine rattled the glass panes of my front windows. I watched from the patio as the 50-foot freight truck hissed its air brakes and settled across my driveway. My father, Hector, stepped down from the passenger side cab. He wore a crisp polo shirt tucked into khaki shorts, his chest puffed out, shoulders squared. He was a man bracing for a shouting match, ready to bulldoze his way through any objections I might raise. My father always believed volume was an acceptable substitute for authority. Behind him, my mother Carmen emerged from the back seat of his sedan. She held a cloth handkerchief, wearing her carefully rehearsed expression of sheer exhaustion. She sighed loudly, wiping imaginary sweat from her forehead. She was ready to play the tragic victim the second I showed any resistance. I offered them no resistance. I opened the front door, stepped onto the wooden deck, and carried a tray holding 4 glasses of iced tea. Condensation dripped down the sides of the glass. I kept my posture relaxed and my expression pleasant. "Welcome to the rental," I said smoothly. I handed the first glass to my father. Hector froze his hand, stopping midair. The loud speech he had prepared about family duty and shared sacrifices died in his throat. Carmen blinked, dropping her handkerchief to her side. They had spent the drive down the coast preparing to breach a barricade. I gave them hospitality wrapped in strict corporate terminology. By acknowledging their arrival as a commercial transaction rather than a familial invasion, I stripped them of their expected victimhood. My sister-in-law, Jessica, did not care about the subtle shift in tension. She strutted up the driveway, ignoring the iced tea entirely. She pointed a manicured finger toward my front door. "You guys take the executive desk, straight into the room on the left," she instructed the 3 hired men. "Toss whatever old junk is in there out to the curb. We need a clean slate for Mateo's new workspace." The room on the left was my home office. It held my dual monitor setup, encrypted hard drives, and maritime logbooks. Jessica assumed she could overwrite my career for my brother's convenience, because that was how our family had always operated. Mateo was the sun. The rest of us were just orbiting rocks meant to clear his path and absorb the impacts. I set the drink tray down on the patio table. I walked down the wooden steps and intercepted the lead mover just as he hoisted a corner of the heavy mahogany desk. He wore a uniform shirt with a bonded carrier logo patched on the chest. "Excuse me," I stated, keeping my tone conversational but firm. I handed him a clipboard holding a single sheet of printed paper. "This is a commercial liability waiver. If you cross the threshold of that specific office, your bonding company becomes legally liable for $100,000 in federal logistics equipment and encrypted maritime data. Please sign here before proceeding." The mover stopped. He looked at the paper, then looked at the heavy wooden desk in his hands. Freight movers do not mess with commercial liability. He lowered his end of the desk to the concrete driveway. "We are not touching that room, lady," he announced to Jessica. "We are not insured for federal data." Jessica gasped, her mouth falling open in shock. She turned to Hector, stamping her foot on the pavement. Hector marched over, his face flushing red with indignation. "Amelinda, stop being dramatic," he snapped. "Your brother needs a place to conduct his business. You can work from the kitchen counter. Move your things." I looked at my father. I did not cross my arms. I maintained an open, unthreatening stance. "That is a federal security violation, Dad," I replied evenly. "I cannot expose port manifests to unauthorized personnel. The movers can put the desk in the garage, or they can take it back to Houston. The choice is yours." Hector glared at me. He searched my face for the petulant teenager he used to ground for talking back. He only found a 34-year-old property manager holding a clipboard. He waved his hand in disgust and ordered the men to leave the desk in the garage. I smiled again. "Let me help you with those smaller boxes," I offered. I picked up a carton labeled kitchen supplies and led my mother inside. I played the role of the compliant, helpful daughter perfectly. I guided them down the hallway to the guest rooms they had demanded. I watched their faces closely as they opened the doors. Carmen stopped in the doorway of the ocean view room. Her eyes scanned the bare white hotel-grade sheets, the empty walls, the generic metal nightstand. "Where is the coastal quilt?" she asked, her voice faltering. "Where is the vintage writing desk you restored?" "Oh, we had to put those in storage to comply with lodging health codes," I lied effortlessly. "Commercial standards require easily sanitized surfaces to maintain the license. I hope Mateo finds the mattress comfortable. It is the required hospitality grade." They had nothing to argue against. I was agreeing with their presence while simultaneously neutralizing their comfort. They wanted a warm, familiar home to pillage. I gave them a sterile waiting room. I carried 3 more boxes inside, observing their every move. Mateo walked in moments later. He looked exhausted and defeated, refusing to make eye contact with me. He dropped his leather duffel bag on the bare floor and immediately complained about the lack of a television in the room. I offered him a polite apology about commercial wiring regulations. The physical invasion was contained, but the psychological war of boundaries was just beginning. I knew my parents would not accept the sterile environment for long. They needed to assert ownership. They needed to plant a flag. The real threat materialized an hour later. The movers had departed, leaving the freight truck empty and my driveway clear. The heavy furniture sat awkwardly in the living room and the garage clashing with the space. I stood in the kitchen, wiping down the granite island with a damp cloth. Carmen was unpacking a box of ceramic dishes near the entryway console table. I kept my focus on the sponge in my hand, but my peripheral vision caught a deliberate, stealthy movement. A stack of my personal mail sat on the console table. It included my recent water bill, the electric statement, and a property tax notice from the city. I watched her reflection in the dark glass of the oven door. Carmen glanced over her shoulder, checking to see if I was looking at her. Satisfied that I was distracted by the cleaning, she reached out quickly. She slid the entire stack of envelopes off the polished wood and slipped them directly into her oversized leather purse. She zipped the bag shut with a swift, practiced motion. My heart beat a slow, measured rhythm against my ribs. You do not steal someone else's utility bills unless you are trying to forge a paper trail. She was gathering proof of address. They were already moving to the next phase of their plan. Day 3 of the occupation. The Gulf humidity clung to my skin as I parked my car on Wednesday afternoon. At the port, a displaced shipping container throws off the entire center of gravity for a freighter. You notice the imbalance immediately, long before you see the cargo. Walking up my own driveway, I felt that same structural shift before I even unlocked my front door. My garage was open. Stacked against the far wall sat 4 heavy cardboard boxes. I walked over and folded back the flaps of the top carton. Inside lay my framed nautical charts, the woven seagrass baskets I kept in the hallway, and a collection of smooth driftwood I had spent 2 years gathering from the Galveston shoreline. My presents had been packed away. I entered the house through the interior door. The living room had been entirely rearranged. My sleek modern sofa was pushed against the far wall to make room for an imposing dark leather recliner that smelled like cheap cigar smoke. Mateo must have insisted the movers sneak it in while I was at work. Carmen and Jessica stood near the sliding glass doors. Jessica held a yellow tape measure, stretching it across the window frame. She was literally measuring for new drapes. Carmen turned, holding a dusting cloth. "Oh, good, you are home," she said cheerfully. "Do not mind the mess. We spent the afternoon organizing. It was just so cluttered, sweetie. You really need more open floor space if Mateo is going to host client meetings here." I did not yell. I did not ask them who gave them permission to dismantle my sanctuary. Any outward display of anger would only validate their assumption that they held power over my emotional state. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I opened the commercial security application tied to my ceiling cameras. I navigated to the recorded timeline from 2 hours prior. The high-definition feed showed Carmen and Jessica marching through my living room, dismantling my decor, and carrying LLC property out to the garage. They were altering a registered commercial space without authorization. I tapped the export button, saving the unedited video file directly to my encrypted cloud storage. "Looks much more spacious, Mom," I replied evenly. Carmen beamed, mistaking my calm demeanor for submission. "I knew you would appreciate it. We have a vision for this place." A vision. The word echoed in my mind as I walked to my bedroom and locked the door behind me. My family always had a vision, and it never included me holding any ground. Growing up in our Houston suburbs, space was an abstract concept for anyone not named Mateo. He received the master suite on the second floor because he needed room for his sports equipment and his study groups. I was assigned to the cramped room near the laundry area. When he outgrew his closet, my parents moved his winter coats into mine. When he needed a quiet place to practice his debate speeches, my father removed the lock from my bedroom door so I could not shut myself away, while Mateo paced the hallway. My space was always treated as overflow storage for his ambition. I accepted it because children internalize the geography they are given. Aunt Rosa was the only one who interrupted that geography. I was 16, sitting on the front porch step trying to study for a chemistry exam while Mateo hosted a loud pool party in the backyard. Rosa pulled her car into the driveway, took one look at my textbook, and sat down next to me. "You cannot expect them to give you a quiet room, Amalinda," she told me, her voice low and steady. "People who take up too much oxygen never notice when someone else is suffocating. If you want a wall, you have to buy the bricks yourself, and you have to hold the deed to the land underneath it." She taught me that boundaries are not requests, they are legal structures. I had bought the bricks, I held the deed. Boxing up my driftwood was just a petty trespass, but it added to the documented file I was building against them. Dinner that evening was another exercise in boundary testing. Carmen had taken over my kitchen, ignoring the fresh seafood in the refrigerator, to cook a heavy, greasy casserole that Hector favored. We sat around the dining table. The ocean breeze blew against the glass, but the air inside felt stifling. Mateo sat at the end of the table, his laptop open next to his plate. He tapped the keyboard with frantic, annoyed keystrokes. He let out a loud, theatrical sigh, pushing his plate away. "This internet speed is a joke," Mateo announced, glaring at me. "I have been trying to upload a pitch deck to a venture capital firm for 20 minutes, and the connection keeps timing out." I took a slow bite of my food. "I pay for a premium fiber optic package," I replied. "It handles commercial-grade data transfers without issue." "Well, it is failing right now," he snapped. "You need to call the provider and upgrade the tier." "I am launching a new business venture, Amalinda. I cannot have lag time when I am securing funding. You need to fix this tomorrow." He was a bankrupt man, sitting in my chair, eating food purchased with my money, demanding I increase my monthly expenses to facilitate his next financial disaster. "I will look into the router settings," I said softly. I finished my meal in silence, cleared my plate, and retreated to the kitchen counter. I opened my own laptop. I did not call the internet service provider. I logged directly into my network administrator portal. The dashboard displayed all connected devices. I easily identified the new additions: a high-end tablet belonging to Jessica, a smartphone registered to Carmen, and an expensive laptop labeled Mateo's MacBook. I navigated to the bandwidth allocation settings. I grouped their specific hardware MAC addresses into a custom restriction category. With 3 clicks, I throttled their combined data limit down to 5 megabits per second. It was just enough bandwidth to load a basic text email, but it would cause any high-definition video call to freeze, any large file upload to crash, and any streaming service to buffer indefinitely. I saved the settings and closed the portal. I did not need to raise my voice to ruin his pitch deck. I just needed administrative access. The dishes were done, the kitchen was clean. I prepared to retreat to my bedroom to review the footage from the day. As I walked down the hallway, Hector stepped out from the shadows of the living room, blocking my path. The jovial, loud persona he wore during dinner had vanished. His posture was rigid, his expression set into hard, calculating lines. He did not look like a guest. He looked like a man preparing to foreclose on a property. "Amalinda, step into the office for a minute," Hector instructed. It was not a request. He gestured toward the room Jessica had tried to empty that morning. I walked past him, my face a carefully blank mask. Hector closed the door behind us, ensuring Carmen and Mateo could not hear. The room was quiet, insulated by the heavy drywall. He reached into his back pocket and withdrew a folded sheet of high-bond paper. He smoothed it out on the surface of my desk. "You have been very accommodating these past few days," Hector began, his tone dripping with forced paternal warmth. "Your mother and I appreciate it. Mateo is under a lot of stress, and family needs to stick together when the economy gets rough." I stared at the paper. I did not offer a comforting reply. "Because we are going to be here for the foreseeable future," Hector continued, picking up a pen from my organizer, "we need to handle some administrative details. Utility companies and tax boards like to see a unified front. I had my lawyer draft this up to make things easier on you." He tapped the top of the page. The bold, capitalized letters read, "Family Asset Sharing Agreement." "Just sign at the bottom," he said, holding the pen out toward me. It is just a formality so I can put the water and electric bills in my name. You work long hours, sweetie. Let your father take some of the burden off your shoulders." I looked at the pen, then down at the dense paragraphs of legal text. I knew exactly what a formality meant in the Lopez family. It meant a trap. I stared at the silver pen Hector held out toward me. The metallic barrel caught the overhead light. In the maritime shipping industry, signing a document without auditing the corresponding manifest is the fastest way to inherit $1 million in liability. You do not trust a smile. You trust the ink. I did not take the pen. I took the paper. I held the high bond sheet carefully, keeping my expression neutral. I scanned the bold header centered at the top of the page. Family Asset Sharing Agreement. It sounded like a harmless, cooperative arrangement, the kind of informal pact relatives might make when splitting a vacation rental. But my logistics training overrode any familial instinct. You never look at the title of a contract. You look at the indemnity clauses, the transfer stipulations, and the fine print buried at the bottom. I read the first paragraph. It contained standard innocuous language about shared household expenses, grocery allocations, and general maintenance duties. It was designed to lull the reader into a false sense of security. I dropped my eyes past the filler text, scanning for the hook. I found it in the fourth paragraph, buried under a dense, unbroken block of legal jargon concerning municipal tax allocations and utility management rights. There it was, the word conveyance. I read the sentence twice to ensure my eyes were not misinterpreting the phrasing. The clause stated that in exchange for assuming all administrative utility management, the primary title holder agreed to convey an undivided 50% interest in the real property located at my exact address to Hector Lopez and Mateo Lopez as joint tenants. It was not a utility contract. It was a quitclaim deed dressed up in domestic terminology. My father was attempting to legally extract half of my $1 million asset under the guise of paying a monthly water bill. Hector had run a similar play when I was 19 years old. I needed a cosigner for my first car, a reliable used sedan to commute to community college. He brought me a thick stack of dealership papers one evening while I was studying. He pointed to the highlighted lines, told me to sign quickly before the financing expired, and smiled his benevolent smile. I signed. A year later, I discovered he had taken out a secondary personal loan against the vehicle's title to fund a lavish anniversary trip for him and Carmen. When I confronted him, he brushed it off, calling it a strategic family tax maneuver. I spent 3 years working double shifts to pay off his vacation. That was the day I stopped signing things I had not personally audited. He assumed I was still that trusting 19-year-old girl. He was banking his entire future on it. I looked up from the paper. Hector's expression remained fixed in that practiced paternal smile. He expected me to nod, express gratitude for his administrative help, and sign away my sanctuary without a second thought. "This is a lot of legal text just to transfer the electric bill, Dad," I said. I kept my voice mild and curious, ensuring no trace of accusation leaked into my tone. Hector waved his hand dismissively, playing the part of the weary patriarch. Lawyers always overcomplicate things to justify their hourly rate. It just protects everyone and keeps the city off our backs. Sign it, and I will handle the municipal offices in the morning. You have enough to worry about at the port. I folded the heavy paper precisely in half. I slipped it into the side pocket of my slacks. I am pretty exhausted tonight. The port was chaotic today. I will review this and sign it tomorrow morning. Hector's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. A brief flash of irritation crossed his dark eyes, but he quickly suppressed it. He knew he could not push too hard without triggering my suspicion. "Do not forget Amelinda," he cautioned, his voice dropping half an octave. "The sooner we get this filed, the sooner we can take these expenses off your plate. We want to help you." "I will not forget," I replied. I turned and walked out of the office, leaving him standing there with his silver pen. I walked straight to my bedroom and locked the door. I pulled the document from my pocket, smoothed out the crease, and placed it on my flatbed scanner. I digitized the pages and drafted a secure, encrypted email to Sylvia Garza. I attached the file with a clear subject line indicating an attempted property conveyance. In the body of the email, I requested her immediate legal review of the fraudulent agreement. I sat on the edge of my mattress. The sheer audacity of the trap shifted my internal calculus. My parents were desperate. Mateo was drowning in debt. But a quitclaim deed is not liquid cash. Gaining a 50% stake in my property would not immediately resolve Mateo's crushing financial obligations or replenish my parents' drained bank accounts. Equity is only useful if you can borrow against it or sell it. Since they knew I would never agree to sell the home, they had to be aiming for leverage. They needed my house as collateral for fresh capital. I opened a new browser window on my laptop. I needed to understand exactly what Mateo was pitching to investors. He had complained loudly about his pitch deck and his new venture at dinner. I ran a search query on the Texas Secretary of State Business Registry using Mateo's full legal name. The state database returned a hit almost immediately. A new corporate entity had been registered just 3 weeks ago, Apex Logistics Solutions, LLC. Mateo was listed as the sole managing director. The registered business address was not a commercial office suite in Houston. It was my Galveston beach house. He had already established a corporate footprint on my property before the moving truck ever arrived in my driveway. I dug deeper into the financial architecture. I accessed a commercial credit reporting database I frequently utilized at the port to vet new shipping vendors and independent freight operators. I ran a comprehensive query on Apex Logistics Solutions. A newly minted corporate entity typically has zero credit history, but the search returned an active inquiry flag. A financial institution had requested a hard pull on the company profile within the last 48 hours. The inquiring entity was not a standard venture capital firm or an angel investor network. It was a regional commercial bank that specialized in federal lending programs. I accessed the detailed inquiry report, bypassing the summary, to read the raw data. The document outlined a pending application for a small business administration loan. The requested capital was substantial, $500,000. SBA loans require rigorous underwriting protocols. They demand a viable business plan, pristine personal guarantees, and hard physical assets to secure the federal debt. Mateo had a fresh corporate bankruptcy and zero liquid capital to his name. He had nothing of value to pledge to a bank. I scrolled down to the collateral section of the pending loan application summary. My breath caught in my throat, the air freezing in my lungs. The screen blurred for a moment before my focus sharpened into cold, calculated clarity. Listed under primary real estate collateral formally submitted to a federally backed lending institution to secure a $500,000 commercial loan was the exact address and parcel number of my beach house. I sat in the dim light of the kitchen, letting the reality of the Small Business Administration loan application settle into my mind. The numbers on the screen did not align with the mechanics of the financial world. Federal lending institutions do not operate on verbal promises or familial assumptions. You cannot simply write down an address on a commercial loan application and expect an underwriter to wire $500,000 to a bankrupt tech founder. The bank requires a verified chain of title. They pull property records. They require the legal owner to sign the pledge of collateral. Mateo did not own the beach house. I did not sign a pledge. Therefore, a secondary mechanism had to exist. There had to be a bridge connecting my brother's fraudulent loan application to my corporate asset. I closed the commercial credit database and reopened the Galveston County Clerk portal. I adjusted the search parameters. Instead of searching the property address, I queried my full legal name and the registered entity name of my LLC. The system returned a new entry. It had been processed and recorded exactly 14 days ago. This was long before my mother called to announce their arrival. This was long before the freight truck hissed its air brakes in my driveway. They had been plotting the seizure of my property for weeks. The document was categorized under general authorizations. I clicked the hyperlink to download the scanned public record. The header read, General Durable Power of Attorney. I read the text line by line. The document appointed Hector Lopez as my legal agent, granting him broad, unrestricted authority over my financial accounts, my real estate holdings, and my corporate entities. It specifically included the power to encumber property, sign loan guarantees, and pledge collateral on my behalf. It gave him the legal right to sign my name and bind me to his decisions. I scrolled to the final page. There was my signature resting on the designated line. It was a practiced imitation, but it was not mine. When you sign dozens of cargo manifests every week standing on a concrete dock with the Gulf wind pushing against your clipboard, your handwriting develops a specific, hurried rhythm. My capital letters lean sharply to the right, and the tail of my last name drops below the baseline in a straight, definitive stroke. The signature on the screen was too careful. The curves were drawn, not written. The pressure of the pen was uniform, lacking the natural variation of a quick, authentic signature. Below the forged ink sat a notary seal. A licensed notary public had stamped the page, swearing under oath that I had appeared before them in person, presented valid identification, and signed the document of my own free will. I looked at the date of the notarization. It was the second Tuesday of the previous month. The timestamp next to the notary signature read 2:30 in the afternoon. That specific Tuesday was etched into my memory. We had received a shipment of volatile industrial solvents at the port. Protocol for hazardous chemicals requires the senior logistics coordinator to be physically present on the secure dock for the duration of the offloading process. I logged into my secure employee portal. I pulled my access history for that day. The port utilizes biometric security scanners to track personnel movement in restricted zones. The log showed my fingerprint scanning onto Terminal 4 at 6 in the morning. I did not scan out until 7 at night. I had spent the entire day inside a federally secured maritime perimeter surrounded by customs agents, dock workers, and time-stamped security cameras. I was 60 miles away from the Houston Strip Mall where this notary operated. I had the biometric data to prove it. The situation had fundamentally shifted. We were no longer dealing with petty domestic manipulation. We were no longer discussing a greedy father trying to sneak his name onto a utility bill, or a mother boxing up my driftwood decor. By filing a forged power of attorney with the county clerk, Hector had committed a state felony. By using that forged document to authorize the pledge of my property for a federally backed Small Business Administration loan, Mateo had committed wire fraud and bank fraud. These were federal crimes. They carried mandatory minimum sentences. They carried severe financial penalties. My family had crossed a line that erased any remaining obligation I felt toward them. They were not treating me like a daughter or a sister. They were treating me like a mark. I connected my laptop to the wireless printer sitting on the kitchen counter. The machine whirred to life. I printed the Small Business Administration loan summary. I printed the forged power of attorney. I printed my biometric port access logs. I gathered the fraudulent family asset sharing agreement Hector had handed me earlier that evening. I stacked the pages neatly, aligning the corners with precise taps against the granite island. I opened the thick manila folder I had started the night before. I placed the new documents inside, securing the clasp. I did not pick up the phone to call the police. I did not contact the district attorney. If I confronted them now, Hector would claim he thought he had verbal permission to act as my agent. Mateo would feign ignorance about the collateral requirements, blaming a misunderstanding with the loan officer. They would hire defense attorneys, muddy the waters, and drag me into a drawn-out legal battle while continuing to occupy my home. I needed the trap to close so tightly around them that no lawyer could pry it open. I needed them to commit to the fraud in a way they could never retract. I needed the external variables to intersect at the exact right moment. Thursday passed in a slow, suffocating routine. I woke up, brewed coffee, and said good morning to the people actively trying to steal my future. I watched them sit at my dining table eating toast and discussing their plans for the day. Hector asked if I had signed his agreement yet. I told him I needed the weekend to read it over. He patted my shoulder, his smile tight but patient, confident that my compliance was inevitable. I went to work. I managed my manifests. I checked the commercial security cameras on my phone every hour. I watched Jessica lounge on the patio while Carmen rearranged my pantry shelves. I maintained my discipline. I let them feel comfortable. I let them feel victorious. I treated the day like an extended surveillance operation. Friday afternoon arrived. The port operations wrapped up earlier than anticipated due to a favorable shift in the shipping schedule. I left the terminal at 3, eager to return to the island and monitor the environment. I drove down the coastal highway, the bright afternoon sun reflecting blindingly off the water. The rhythmic sound of the tires on the asphalt provided a steady cadence to my thoughts. I reviewed my checklists. The folder was secure. The cameras were recording. The LLC firewall was holding firm. I turned onto my street and eased my foot off the accelerator. I slowed my vehicle as my house came into view. A white commercial van was parked squarely in my driveway. The side panel of the van displayed the bold blue logo of a local locksmith company. I pulled to the curb and put the car in park. I did not rush out of the driver's seat. I observed the scene through the windshield, gathering the visual data before making my approach. Standing on the front porch of my property, his arms crossed over his chest in a stance of supreme authority, was Hector. He was watching a man in a gray work uniform lean heavily against my front door. The loud, high-pitched whine of a power drill echoed down the quiet street as the locksmith drove a metal bit straight through the center of my deadbolt. I turned the engine off. The high-pitched whine of a power drill biting into solid metal echoed down the quiet coastal street. I sat in the driver's seat for a few seconds, observing the scene through my windshield. A white commercial van bearing the logo of a local security company idled in my driveway. On my front porch stood Hector, his posture relaxed, his arms crossed over his chest. He watched with profound satisfaction as a technician in a gray uniform systematically destroyed the deadbolt on my front door. I unbuckled my seatbelt and picked up my leather work tote. I did not rush. Hurrying signals panic, and panic concedes power. I walked up the concrete path with the measured, deliberate stride of a logistics auditor conducting a site inspection. The afternoon heat pressed against my skin, but my internal temperature remained cold and focused. Hector spotted my approach. He did not display a single ounce of guilt. Instead, he adjusted his stance, adopting the magnanimous, benevolent persona he utilized whenever he wanted to mask a transgression. He raised a hand in a casual greeting as I climbed the wooden stairs. The drill whined again, sending a cascade of tiny brass shavings tumbling onto my welcome mat. "The old locks were sticky," Amalinda Hector announced. His voice was coated in a thick layer of artificial paternal warmth. "I am upgrading us to smart locks. We are putting in a digital keypad. It is much safer for everyone. I will give you the code later." 7 words that laid his entire strategy bare. He was not repairing a faulty mechanism. He was physically usurping control of my asset. By installing a digital lock that he managed, he was granting himself the power to dictate my access to my own sanctuary. This tactic was a cornerstone of his parenting philosophy. In my family, access was a currency my father hoarded. When I was 17, I purchased a diary with my wages from a summer job. I secured it with a tiny brass padlock. Hector found the journal in my desk, snapped the clasp with a pair of heavy pliers, and informed me that secrets bred dysfunction. He viewed privacy as an act of defiance. Controlling the doors, the bank accounts, and the schedules was how he maintained his position at the top of the familial hierarchy. He assumed I would submit to that hierarchy today. I did not acknowledge my father. I did not argue about the condition of the hardware. I walked right past him, stopping 12 inches away from the locksmith. The technician paused the drill, pulling his safety glasses down to rest around his neck. He wiped sweat from his brow, looking between Hector and me with mild confusion. "Sir, my name is Amalinda Lopez." I stated my tone, projecting the flat, undeniable authority of a port official. "I am the registered agent for Rosas Retreat LLC, the corporate entity that holds the exclusive deed to this property." I reached into my tote and retrieved a slim manila envelope. I carry copies of my corporate paperwork at all times for tax and compliance purposes. I extracted the official articles of incorporation, my state-issued Texas identification card, and the commercial short-term lodging license granted by the city of Galveston. I handed the stack of documents to the technician. "You have been hired by a temporary guest to drill the lock of a registered commercial facility without the property owner's consent," I told him. I maintained direct eye contact, refusing to blink. "Stop your work right now, remove your equipment from my porch, or I am filing an immediate liability claim against your surety bond. I will also forward this incident to the state licensing board for unauthorized property modification." The locksmith looked at my identification, then scanned the corporate seal on the state license. The color drained out of his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. Independent contractors operating in Texas fear the state regulatory board far more than they fear a disgruntled customer. A mark against his bond could ruin his insurance premiums for a decade. He did not ask Hector for clarification. He did not attempt to mediate the dispute. He slammed his drill into reverse, yanked the metal bit out of the ruined brass cylinder, and tossed his equipment into a canvas tool bag. I was told he was the homeowner, the technician stammered, backing away toward the stairs. "I am not getting involved in a corporate title dispute. Have a good afternoon." The man practically sprinted to his van. The tires chirped against the asphalt as he sped away, leaving a jagged, empty hole where my deadbolt used to be. Hector stood frozen on the wooden planks. The performance of the caring patriarch evaporated. His jaw clenched so tight, the muscles twitched under his skin. His face darkened, a deep, angry flush rising from his collar to his hairline. He opened his mouth, searching for a command that would restore his dominance. But I had bypassed his authority entirely. I had neutralized his threat by appealing to a system he could not manipulate. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a commercial security vendor I frequently contracted for warehouse access control at the shipping terminals. The dispatcher answered on the first ring. "I need an emergency hardware replacement at my Galveston location," I instructed the operator. "A standard commercial-grade deadbolt, no digital components. Bill the emergency dispatch fee directly to the secondary credit card I have on file." 3 years ago, Hector and Carmen experienced a sudden plumbing failure. Their water heater ruptured, flooding their garage. They claimed their bank accounts were temporarily frozen due to a processing error. I loaned them $2,000 to cover the replacement. Because I understood my parents' financial habits, I processed the repayment plan through a secure digital invoicing platform. The system stored the digital token for Hector's primary credit card. The loan was paid off, but the authorized payment token remained active in my vendor portal. Since Hector had orchestrated the destruction of my property, I utilized that authorized token to cover the $400 emergency fee. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. I turned to face my father. "The new hardware will be installed in 20 minutes, I said, keeping my volume low and steady. "There will be no smart keypad. I will retain the sole key. The repair costs have already been charged to your Visa." Hector glared at me, his fists clenching at his sides. He recognized the shift in power. He spun on his heel and marched into the house, letting the heavy wooden door slam shut behind him. I waited outside in the coastal heat. 20 minutes later, the commercial vendor arrived. He installed a reinforced steel deadbolt and handed me 2 fresh brass keys. I slid one onto my daily key ring and secured the backup inside my hidden lockbox. I walked into the living room, the cool air conditioning washing over my face. I expected to find Hector pacing the floor, ready to escalate the argument. Instead, the room was quiet. My mother sat at the dining table, her posture perfectly straight. She did not look defeated by the failure on the front porch. She looked triumphant. Carmen held a thick, formal envelope bearing the official seal of the Municipal Zoning Board. If the physical takeover had failed, she was fully prepared to execute their secondary strategy. She slid the official document across the polished wood table toward me, her lips curving into a cold, satisfied smile. They had initiated the next phase of their residency claim. I stood in my own living room looking at the thick, formal envelope resting on the polished wood of my dining table. The return address bore the official seal of the Municipal Zoning Board of Galveston. My mother sat across from the document, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her posture was pristine. She radiated the quiet, terrifying satisfaction of a woman who believed she had just delivered a checkmate. I recognized the envelope immediately. It was the exact type of municipal notice generated when a property inspector flags a code violation. I did not reach for it. I waited for her to reveal the mechanism of her trap. "You were very busy at the port yesterday," Carmen began. Her tone was sugary, coated in an artificial maternal concern that always preceded a betrayal. Mateo needed to set up his home gym to relieve his stress. Physical health is so important for an entrepreneur. He bought some lumber and poured a concrete footer in the backyard for a weightlifting platform. It is a beautiful structure. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second. A concrete footer. While I was managing shipping manifests and stopping a locksmith from destroying my front door, my brother had hired day laborers to pour cement and build an unauthorized structure on my commercial property. The city code enforcement officer happened to drive by. Carmen continued, her smile widening into a predatory grin. He issued a stop work order. He said we needed a municipal permit for a permanent outdoor structure. So your father handled it. He took the utility bills down to the city planning office this morning. The utility bills. The stack of mail I watched her slide into her oversized leather purse 2 days ago. She had not stolen them out of simple curiosity. She had stolen them to manufacture a paper trail. Hector showed the clerk the utility statements to prove we inhabit the property, Carmen said, her voice dropping into a register of cold triumph. He filed the permit application in his own name. The city approved it. Hector is officially registered with the municipal government as a resident making structural improvements to this address. We are residents now, sweetie. You cannot just lock us out. The strategy was devious, and under different circumstances it would have been devastatingly effective. Texas property laws heavily favor the occupant. If a person can establish a documented paper trail of residency, such as receiving official mail, paying utilities, or pulling municipal permits in their name, local law enforcement will categorize them as legal tenants. Once that tenancy is established, removing them requires a formal eviction process through the justice of the peace. A standard residential eviction can drag on for months, requiring multiple court hearings, mandatory notice periods, and thousands of dollars in legal fees. During that entire protracted timeline, the occupants are legally allowed to remain in the home. My parents knew this. They had researched the eviction loopholes. They had executed a coordinated legal maneuver to cement their physical presence in my sanctuary, buying themselves at least 6 months of free housing, while Mateo tried to secure his fraudulent business loan. This was my mother's signature move. Carmen always used bureaucracy as a weapon. When I was 18 years old, I received an acceptance letter to a prestigious supply chain management program at an out-of-state university. I was thrilled. I left the letter on the kitchen counter. The next day, it vanished. Carmen told me I must have misplaced it. 2 weeks later, I received an email from the university admissions office confirming the receipt of my formal withdrawal of enrollment. Carmen had intercepted the mail, forged my signature on the rejection form, and mailed it back to the registrar. She then handed me a brochure for the local community college, insisting it was better for the family if I stayed close to home and continued paying rent for my childhood bedroom. She controlled people by manipulating their paperwork. She looked at me now across my dining table, expecting me to crumble. She expected the realization of her trap to break my resolve. She anticipated tears, panic, and a desperate plea for a truce. I did not offer her a single drop of emotion. I pulled out one of the dining chairs and sat down. I picked up the municipal envelope, slid my finger under the flap, and extracted the official citation. I read the printed text. It was a formal notice of unpermitted structural modification, just as she had described. It listed Hector Lopez as the primary applicant on the retroactive permit. I set the paper down. I pulled my laptop from my leather work tote and opened the screen. I connected to my secure administrative network. "You researched residential tenancy laws, Mom," I said, keeping my vocal cadence flat and precise. It was a smart strategy. If I owned this house as a private citizen, that permit would indeed complicate a residential eviction. I navigated to the official Galveston Municipal Zoning portal. I bypassed the standard residential landing page and clicked into the commercial property database. I typed in the parcel number for my beach house. The screen populated with the active corporate profile for Rosas Retreat, LLC. I turned the laptop around, pushing the screen across the polished wood so Carmen could read the digital text. This property is not a residential home, I explained, pointing to the bold red lettering at the top of the municipal profile. It is a registered commercial short-term lodging facility. The zoning regulations are fundamentally different. Commercial entities are subject to strict corporate compliance codes. Carmen's smile faltered. Her eyes darted across the screen, trying to comprehend the dense municipal jargon. When you alter a commercial property without prior architectural approval from the City Planning Commission, it is not a minor residential code violation. I continued, my voice steady and unrelenting. It is a commercial safety hazard. Because Hector used those stolen utility bills to falsely present himself as a resident, and because he filed the retroactive permit application under his own Social Security number, he formally assumed all liability for the unauthorized construction. I clicked a hyperlink on the screen, opening the penalty schedule for commercial zoning violations. I highlighted the relevant paragraph. The City of Galveston levies an immediate, non-negotiable fine for unpermitted structural modifications on commercial properties, I stated. The penalty is $1,000 per day, calculated from the moment the structure was initiated until it is fully demolished and cleared by a municipal inspector. Since Hector filed the paperwork claiming ownership of the project, the city will not bill the LLC. They will bill him directly. The color vanished from Carmen's face. The triumphant posture collapsed, leaving her shoulders slumped. Mateo poured that concrete footer yesterday, I added, checking my watch. That means Hector currently owes the city of Galveston $2,000. By tomorrow morning, it will be $3,000. If he refuses to pay, the city will issue a lien against his personal assets and garnish his bank accounts. I suggest you tell Mateo to buy a sledgehammer and start breaking up that concrete before the sun goes down. My mother stared at the glowing screen. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. She had attempted to forge a chain to bind me to her, and I had simply handed the other end of the chain to the municipal tax collector. The silence in the room stretched thick and suffocating. The air conditioning unit hummed softly in the background. I reached across the table, closed my laptop, and slid it back into my tote. The paper trail they had tried to build was now actively burning a hole in their remaining finances. Before Carmen could formulate a defense, a sharp, repetitive sound cut through the tension. The doorbell rang. It was a loud, demanding chime. I stood up from the table. Carmen remained frozen in her chair, her eyes fixed on the blank space where my laptop had been. I walked down the short hallway and peered through the security peephole set into the heavy wooden door. Standing on my front porch was a man I did not recognize. He wore a tailored charcoal gray suit, a crisp white shirt, and a navy blue tie. He held a leather portfolio clipboard resting against his forearm. His posture was rigid, professional, and entirely devoid of the casual demeanor of a neighbor or a salesperson. He looked like an auditor. I unlocked the newly installed deadbolt and opened the door. "Good afternoon," the man said. His voice was brisk and authoritative. He glanced down at his clipboard, verifying a piece of information before meeting my gaze. "I am looking for Mateo Lopez." I did not step aside. I kept my hand firmly on the door handle. "May I ask who is inquiring?" The man reached into his suit jacket pocket and retrieved a thick, embossed business card. He handed it to me. "My name is Marcus Vance," he replied. "I am an asset inspector and collateral verification officer for Sterling Commercial Lending. I am here to conduct a physical site inspection for a pending federal loan application." My pulse steadied into a slow, rhythmic drumbeat. The trap I had been monitoring was no longer a theoretical threat. The federal consequence had arrived on my doorstep. I looked past the inspector, glancing toward the hallway leading to the guest rooms, where my brother was currently hiding. The external threat had officially breached the perimeter, and the final sequence of my logistics plan was ready to commence. The inspector stood on my front porch, his charcoal suit immaculate against the humid Galveston afternoon. He held a leather portfolio, his posture radiating the sterile authority of a financial auditor. He had identified himself as Marcus Vance, an asset inspector for Sterling Commercial Lending. He was here to verify the collateral for a federal loan application. The external consequence of my brother's fraud had literally arrived at my door. I did not flinch. I held the door open, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. Before I could answer him, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the hallway behind me. Matteo practically sprinted into the entryway. His face was flushed, a sheen of sweat already forming on his forehead. He had likely been monitoring the driveway from the guest room window. He shoved past me, attempting to place his body between the inspector and the interior of the house. Mr. Vance, Matteo stammered, his voice tight with forced joviality. "You are early. I thought our appointment was for tomorrow. Let us go around back. I want to show you the new structural improvements we are making for the corporate headquarters." Matteo reached out, trying to physically guide the inspector toward the side gate. He wanted to keep the man outside, away from any questions, and specifically away from me. He needed to control the narrative of the site visit to maintain the illusion that he owned the property. I stepped sideways, smoothly blocking the exit path. I did not raise my voice or show any alarm. I simply smiled, the warm, practiced smile of a hospitality professional. "Good afternoon, Mr. Vance," I said, extending my hand. "I am Amalinda Lopez. I am the registered property manager for Rosas Retreat, LLC. Please come inside out of the heat. Let me get you a glass of iced coffee while you conduct your site inspection." Matteo shot me a look of pure, unadulterated panic. His eyes widened silently, pleading with me to stop talking. I ignored him entirely. I stepped back, gesturing for the inspector to enter my home. Vance stepped over the threshold, his eyes scanning the living room. He noted the stark lack of office equipment, the missing commercial infrastructure, and the clearly residential layout. He clicked his pen, preparing to take notes. "Thank you, Miss Lopez," Vance replied, his tone professional and detached. "I am here to verify the physical asset listed as primary collateral on a pending federal loan application submitted by Apex Logistics Solutions. Mr. Matteo Lopez is listed as the primary title holder of this property." I walked to the kitchen island, pulling a fresh glass from the cabinet. I poured the iced coffee with steady hands. "There seems to be a misunderstanding regarding the corporate structure of this location," I stated clearly, handing him the cold glass. "Apex Logistics Solutions does not hold the deed to this property. Neither does Matteo Lopez. This address is exclusively owned by Rosas Retreat, LLC. We operate as a licensed commercial short-term lodging facility." Matteo was hyperventilating near the front door. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, trying to interrupt. "Amalinda, please," he hissed. "This is a private business matter. You do not understand what is happening." "I understand perfectly," I responded, keeping my focus entirely on the inspector. "Mr. Vance, Matteo, is currently occupying a guest room under a short-term promotional stay. He has zero equity in this property, and he possesses zero legal authority to pledge this asset as collateral for any financial transaction." Vance lowered his glass. The professional detachment evaporated, replaced by the sharp, immediate focus of a risk management officer discovering a critical discrepancy. He opened his leather portfolio, flipping past several pages until he found a specific document. "Miss Lopez," Vance said slowly, choosing his words with extreme care. "I have a sworn affidavit in my file, signed under penalty of perjury, stating that Matteo Lopez has full legal authorization to encumber this property." I reached into my work tote, which sat on the counter. I pulled out the manila envelope containing my corporate documents. I extracted a certified copy of the property deed and the municipal lodging license. I laid them flat on the granite island, positioning them so Vance could read the official seals. "I am aware of the fraudulent paperwork that has been submitted to your underwriting department," I said calmly. "I am also aware of the forged power of attorney currently filed with the county clerk. I have already compiled the necessary documentation to prove the forgery, including time-stamped biometric access logs confirming my physical location at the Port of Galveston during the alleged notarization." Vance stared at the certified deed. He looked at the name of the LLC, then looked at me. His expression was a mixture of shock and professional alarm. He was not just conducting a site visit anymore. He was holding the evidence of a federal crime. I strongly suggest your compliance department halt any pending disbursements to Apex Logistics Solutions. I added my voice, dropping to a serious advisory tone. If your institution proceeds with underwriting a loan based on forged collateral documents, you will be exposing yourselves to significant federal liability. Vance closed his portfolio with a sharp snap. He did not ask any further questions. He had seen enough. The underwriting process was dead, and the fraud investigation was about to begin. "Thank you for your time, Miss Lopez," Vance said briskly. "You have been exceptionally helpful." He turned and walked toward the front door. Mateo tried to follow him, babbling incoherently about a misunderstanding with the lawyers and a mistake in the filing paperwork. Vance ignored him completely. He stepped onto the porch, walked swiftly to his car, and drove away without looking back. I closed the front door. Mateo stood in the hallway, his face the color of ash. He looked at me, his chest heaving, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He had bet his entire fabricated future on his ability to steal my asset, and I had just dismantled his final escape route with a glass of iced coffee and a certified deed. He did not scream. He did not threaten me. He simply turned and walked into his guest room, shutting the door silently behind him. The house was quiet for the rest of the afternoon. My mother stayed in the living room, nervously flipping through a magazine she was not reading. Hector was nowhere to be found, likely still trying to figure out how to mitigate the municipal fines he had incurred by pulling the unauthorized construction permit. They were trapped in a rapidly collapsing house of cards. But Hector remained blinded by his own arrogance. He still believed he could muscle his way out of the crisis through sheer force of will. The tension broke just after 7 in the evening. Hector marched through the front door, his face set in a rigid mask of furious determination. He did not say hello. He walked straight to the dining table, pulled out a chair, and slammed his hand against the wood. "Family meeting," he barked, his voice echoing through the open floor plan. "Everyone at the table? Now." Carmen practically jumped out of her seat, scurrying to the table like a frightened bird. Mateo emerged from his room a few minutes later, looking hollowed out and exhausted. He sat as far away from Hector as the table would allow. I remained standing in the kitchen, leaning against the counter. I did not sit. Sitting implies participation in a shared dialogue. I was not there to negotiate. "Sit down, Amalinda," Hector commanded, pointing to the empty chair across from him. "I am fine standing," I replied evenly. "What is the purpose of this meeting?" Hector glared at me, his patience completely exhausted. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded family asset sharing agreement he had tried to force on me the previous night. He slammed it onto the center of the table. "The purpose of this meeting is loyalty," Hector snarled. "I am done playing games with you. Your brother is facing a minor setback with his business funding, and your mother and I have sacrificed everything to keep this family afloat. It is your turn to step up." He pushed the paper across the wood until it stopped inches from the edge. "I want that document signed right now," Hector demanded, his voice rising to a threatening crescendo. "I want the 50% equity transfer completed tonight. You owe us this. If you refuse to sign that paper and support your brother, you are completely cut out of this family. We will disown you." I remained standing in the kitchen, leaning against the edge of the granite island. The air in the house was thick, suffocating under the weight of Hector's demand. He sat at the head of the dining table, a position he always claimed, regardless of whose roof he was under. His jaw was set, his dark eyes fixed on me with a volatile mix of desperation and fury. He had laid his cards on the table. The illusion of a family visit was dead. It was a raw, undeniable extortion. Carmen shifted nervously in her seat. The dining table was set with careful precision. She had spent the last 2 hours cooking arroz con pollo, my favorite childhood meal. The scent of saffron and slow-cooked chicken filled the room, a culinary weapon designed to trigger nostalgia and compliance. Carmen always believed that a warm plate could erase any transgression. Jessica sat next to Mateo, her posture radiating a smug, entitled confidence. She had likely convinced herself that Hector's aggression would easily break my resistance. She checked her phone, barely paying attention, waiting for the inevitable moment when I would surrender my equity and secure her lifestyle. "You owe us this," Amalinda Hector repeated, his voice vibrating with aggressive finality. "We raised you. We put a roof over your head. Mateo needs this equity to launch his business. We are not asking. I am telling you to sign that paper." He pushed the fraudulent family asset sharing agreement toward me again. I looked at the four of them. The patriarch who believed he owned me. The mother who used guilt as a currency. The brother who stole from me to fund his failures. The sister-in-law who viewed my sanctuary as an inconvenience to be remodeled. They were a cohesive unit of entitlement. I picked up my glass of water from the counter. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The condensation felt cool against my palm. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I did not engage in the emotional theater they desperately needed me to perform. I set the glass down. I picked up my leather work tote, opened the main compartment, and pulled out a stack of crisp white papers. I walked over to the dining table. I did not touch the agreement Hector had slid toward me. Instead, I dealt the papers I had brought like a dealer at a casino table. I slid one sheet to Hector, one to Carmen, one to Mateo, and one to Jessica. The papers were not legal arguments. They were not cease and desist letters. They were invoices. Printed on high-quality commercial stock, each document bore the official letterhead of Rosas Retreat, LLC. They were detailed, itemized billing statements. Hector looked down at the paper, his brow furrowed in confusion. He expected a deed. He received a bill. "What is this nonsense?" he demanded, slapping the paper with the back of his hand. "As per Texas commercial lodging statutes," I stated, my voice projecting the flat, undeniable cadence of a port auditor. "Your complimentary 3-day promotional stay at this facility has officially expired." I walked back to the kitchen counter and folded my arms. "You are no longer considered temporary guests. You are now occupying a registered commercial suite," I explained, looking directly at Hector. "The established daily rate for this specific property, as registered with the City of Galveston and clearly posted on our commercial booking portal, is $400 per night." I gestured to the invoices resting in front of them. "Because you occupy 2 rooms, the total daily charge is $800. I continued. "Factoring in the previous nights, your outstanding balance currently totals $2,400. Mateo stared at the invoice. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly under the dining room chandelier. He was already bankrupt. The sudden imposition of a commercial debt was a shock his fragile financial state could not process. "This is a joke," Jessica sneered, crossing her arms. She refused to even look at the paper. "You cannot charge your own family rent. It is not rent, Jessica," I corrected her immediately. "Rent implies tenancy. This is a commercial lodging fee. If you fail to settle the outstanding balance by tomorrow morning, the LLC will initiate immediate collection procedures against your remaining credit accounts." I looked back at Hector. "Furthermore, standard checkout time for this facility is 11 o'clock in the morning. Since your account is delinquent, your reservation will not be extended. You are required to vacate the premises by 11 a.m. tomorrow." The silence in the dining room was profound. The aroma of the arroz con pollo lingered, a stark contrast to the cold, bureaucratic eviction I had just delivered. I had not argued about family loyalty. I had not debated the merits of Mateo's business. I had simply presented them with an unpayable invoice. Hector stared at the paper for a long, agonizing minute. He read the itemized charges. He read the corporate heading. He read the strict payment terms. Then he began to laugh. It was not a humorous sound. It was a loud, booming, derisive bark. It was the sound of a man trying to project dominance over a situation he fundamentally misunderstood. He picked up the invoice with both hands and ripped it straight down the middle. He tossed the shredded halves onto the center of the table, letting them flutter over the carefully arranged dishes. You think a piece of paper scares me? Hector boomed, his face red with exertion. You think you can print out a fake hotel bill and scare your own father out of this house? He stood up from his chair, leaning over the table, his physical presence designed to intimidate. We live here now, Amalinda, he snarled, his voice echoing off the walls. I pulled the municipal permits. I established residency. I know the law. If you want us gone, you have to formally evict us through the courts. That process takes 6 months minimum. We are not going anywhere. Hector stood over the dining table, his chest heaving with the exertion of his own manufactured rage. He had shredded the commercial invoice, believing that destroying the physical paper somehow negated the reality of the debt. He glared at me, waiting for me to back down, waiting for me to revert to the compliant daughter who always surrendered whenever he raised his voice. When I did not move, he slowly lowered himself back into his chair. He leaned back, crossing his thick arms over his chest. He adopted a posture of supreme, untouchable arrogance. He was pivoting from intimidation to legal manipulation. You cannot evict us, Amalinda, Hector stated, his tone dropping to a condescending sneer. I know how this works. I spent the afternoon reading about property laws. He leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table, eager to educate me on a subject he fundamentally misunderstood. We have been here for 3 days, Hector continued. We have our personal belongings in those bedrooms. We receive mail here. I pulled a municipal permit under this address. The law considers us legal tenants. If you call the police right now, they will not do a single thing. The cops will tell you it is a civil matter. They will tell you to take it to a judge. And like I said, that takes 6 months. So get comfortable with us being here, because we are not leaving until Mateo secures his funding. He was right about one specific detail. In the state of Texas, law enforcement officers are notoriously hesitant to intervene in residential disputes. If a person can demonstrate even the thinnest veneer of tenancy, the police will classify the situation as a civil conflict, refusing to execute a physical removal without a formal eviction order from a justice of the peace. Squatters weaponize this exact loophole, paralyzing property owners in bureaucratic purgatory while they occupy a home for free. Hector was banking his entire strategy on that single point of friction. I nodded slowly, maintaining a calm, unbothered expression. I acknowledged the validity of his argument within the parameters he had constructed. You are completely correct, Dad, I replied softly. If this were a residential lease, you would be classified as a tenant. The police would absolutely refuse to intervene. You would be protected under the Texas Property Code. Hector smiled, a broad, triumphant grin spreading across his face. He glanced at Carmen, seeking validation for his legal acumen. See, he told her, patting her hand. I told you I had this handled. She cannot do anything. I reached into my leatherwork tote for the second time. I bypassed the shredded remains of the invoice resting on the table. I extracted a fresh sheet of paper. It was not printed on corporate letterhead. It was a direct, unmodified printout from the official Texas State Legislature website. I slid the paper across the polished wood, positioning it squarely in front of him. But this is not a residential lease, I clarified, my voice slicing through his premature celebration. This property operates exclusively under a commercial, short-term lodging license. Hector glanced at the paper, his smile freezing. I highlighted the relevant statute for your convenience, I added, pointing to the yellow marker ink on the page. Section 31.04 of the Texas Penal Code. It defines a specific offense called theft of service. I paused, ensuring he was reading the exact paragraph I indicated. Under Texas law, if a person secures commercial lodging accommodations and subsequently refuses to pay the established rate, or if they refuse to vacate the commercial premises upon the expiration of their authorized stay, the situation is no longer classified as a civil tenancy dispute, I explained, articulating every syllable with deliberate precision. It is classified as a criminal offense. The silence in the room returned, heavier and sharper than before. It is the exact same legal principle as walking out of a restaurant without paying for your meal, I continued. The police do not tell a restaurant owner to take a non-paying customer to civil court. They arrest them for theft. If you refuse to vacate this commercial facility by 11 o'clock tomorrow morning, the Galveston County Sheriff's Department will not ask you for a lease agreement. They will escort you off the property under threat of criminal trespass, and they will cite you for theft of service. Hector's triumphant grin vanished, replaced by a look of profound, unsettling doubt. The legal shield he thought he had forged out of utility bills and municipal permits had just shattered against a commercial zoning loophole he had never anticipated. He looked at Carmen, but she offered no comfort, her eyes wide with mounting panic. Mateo could not tolerate the shift in power. He had watched his father fail to intimidate me, and he saw his own fraudulent financial future evaporating. He pushed his chair back violently, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the floor. He stood up, his face flushed, pointing an accusing finger in my direction. "You are bluffing," Mateo shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "You cannot do any of this." He marched around the edge of the dining table, closing the physical distance between us. He was trying to use his height to establish the dominance our father had just lost. "You do not even have the authority to kick me out," Mateo sneered, jabbing his finger in the air. "You are just a property manager. I own half of this house anyway. Dad signed the agreement. I saw the paperwork. You are bluffing, Amalinda. You are just trying to scare us because you are jealous that I am launching a real business while you are stuck tracking cargo boxes at the port." His arrogance was astonishing. He genuinely believed that a forged document filed in secret somehow superseded reality. He was so accustomed to our parents validating his delusions that he expected the legal system to do the same. I did not step back from him. I held my ground, looking up at his flushed, panicked face. "I am not bluffing, Mateo," I said softly, "and you do not own a single square inch of this property." I turned away from my brother and walked to the kitchen island. Resting near the coffee maker was the thick manila folder I had been meticulously curating since the moment my mother called me on Tuesday morning. The folder held every piece of evidence, every time-stamped log, and every certified public record. It was the physical manifestation of my defense, and it was time to deploy it. I placed my hand on the cover of the folder. I turned back to face my family. Hector was watching me with a growing sense of dread. Carmen was clutching her napkin like a lifeline. Jessica had stopped checking her phone, her attention finally captured by the escalating crisis. Mateo stood frozen in the middle of the room, waiting for me to speak. I smiled. It was not the polite, hospitable smile I had offered the movers. It was not the patient, deferential smile I had given Hector when he handed me the fake deed. It was a genuine, chilling expression of absolute certainty. The trap I had built was fully loaded, the perimeter was secured, and the final sequence was ready for execution. I unhooked the metal clasp on the manila folder and flipped the heavy cardboard cover open. I unhooked the metal clasp on the manila folder. The sound was sharp, a tiny metallic click that echoed loudly in the tense silence of my dining room. I did not rush. I opened the heavy cardboard cover and extracted the top 2 sheets of paper. I walked slowly back to the table, my footsteps measured and deliberate against the hardwood floor. I did not slide these documents across the wood. I placed them down precisely in the center of the table, making sure they were positioned directly between Hector and Mateo. "This," I began, pointing my index finger at the first sheet, "is a copy of a general durable power of attorney filed with the Galveston County Clerk exactly 14 days ago. It grants you, Dad, full authorization to pledge my assets, encumber my property, and sign loan guarantees on my behalf." I tapped the second sheet, a copy of the fake co-op agreement Hector had tried to force me to sign. "And this," I continued, my voice devoid of any inflection, "is the fraudulent quitclaim deed you attempted to disguise as a utility sharing contract." Hector stared at the papers. His chest rose and fell rapidly. He opened his mouth, preparing to launch into a defense of his actions, preparing to claim that he was only acting in the best interest of the family. He never got the chance to speak. "This power of attorney is a forgery," I stated. The word hung in the air, heavy and absolute. "I did not sign this document," I explained, looking directly into my father's eyes. "More importantly, the notary stamp on this page swears under oath that I appeared in person at a strip mall in Houston at 2:30 in the afternoon." I reached back into the folder and pulled out a third sheet of paper. I dropped it on top of the forged documents. "This is a certified, time-stamped biometric access log from the Port of Galveston," I said. "It proves unequivocally that I was physically located inside a federally secured maritime perimeter 60 miles away from that notary at the exact minute this document was supposedly executed." Hector's mouth clamped shut. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. The bluster, the arrogance, the patriarchal dominance he had relied on for his entire life evaporated in an instant. He was no longer a father scolding a rebellious daughter. He was a suspect looking at a chain of evidence. I turned my attention to my brother. Mateo sat frozen, his eyes wide and fixed on the papers. I reached into the pocket of my slacks and retrieved the thick, embossed business card left by Marcus Vance. I flicked it across the table. It slid to a halt right in front of Mateo's plate. "Mateo," I said, dropping my voice to a dangerous quiet register, "you utilized that forged power of attorney to pledge a commercial asset you do not own to secure a $500,000 loan from a federally backed lending institution." My brother swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. "When you submitted that application across state lines using a digital portal, you committed federal wire fraud. I detailed my words precise and unyielding. When you attempted to defraud a financial institution insured by the federal government using falsified collateral documents, you committed federal bank fraud." Mateo slumped back in his chair as if the physical weight of the accusations had physically struck him. I turned back to Hector, focusing on the patriarch who had orchestrated the entire scheme. "And you, Dad," I continued, my gaze locking onto his, "you presented a fraudulent deed to a municipal zoning board to illegally pull construction permits under a false claim of ownership. In the state of Texas, filing a forged instrument with a government agency is a state felony." The dining room went completely dead silent. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound in the entire house was the distant, rhythmic crashing of the Gulf waves against the pilings outside. The ocean continued its ancient motion, completely indifferent to the destruction occurring within the walls of my home. I did not shout. I did not scream. I did not indulge in the emotional catharsis my family expected from a confrontation. I spoke with the cold, detached authority of an auditor closing an account that had suffered a fatal, irrecoverable loss. I had spent my entire life absorbing their chaos. I had watched my parents prioritize Mateo's ambition over my stability. I had watched them excuse his failures and demand my compliance. I had built a fortress to protect myself, and they had spent weeks systematically trying to breach it. They believed they were clever. They believed they were entitled. "You thought you were outsmarting me," I said softly. "You thought you could orchestrate a hostile takeover of my sanctuary and force me to absorb the financial ruin you created." I placed my hands flat on the dining table, leaning forward slightly, ensuring my final declaration resonated with absolute clarity. "You did not move into my house," I stated. "You moved into a federal crime scene of your own making." The silence stretched thick and suffocating. The reality of the situation crashed over them like a rogue wave. This was no longer a family dispute over a bedroom or a shared utility bill. This was a scenario involving federal indictments, grand juries, and mandatory minimum sentences. Mateo dropped the silver fork he had been clutching. It hit his ceramic plate with a sharp, jarring clatter that echoed through the quiet room. His face was chalk white, his eyes darting frantically around the room, as if searching for an escape route that did not exist. He was hyperventilating, his breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. The illusion of the successful entrepreneur had shattered, leaving behind a terrified, bankrupt man facing the full weight of the federal justice system. Jessica, who had remained silent throughout the entire confrontation, suddenly moved. She pushed her chair back from the table. The legs scraped loudly against the hardwood. She stood up slowly, her eyes fixed on the forged documents resting in the center of the table. She did not look at my parents. She did not look at me. She looked at Mateo. Jessica began backing away from the table, putting physical distance between herself and her husband. Her expression was a mixture of horror and cold calculation. She had married a man she believed was destined for wealth and status. She had tolerated his failures because Hector always bailed him out. But Hector could not bail him out of a federal fraud conviction. She took another step backward, her hands trembling as she reached for her purse, resting on the nearby console table. The reality of prison time was setting in, and Jessica was rapidly assessing her own liability in a conspiracy she had married into. The facade of family unity shattered with the concussive force of a dropped glass on concrete. The absolute certainty of their federal exposure stripped away every layer of manufactured authority Hector had ever built. The dining room transformed instantly into an arena of self-preservation. They turned on each other with the viciousness of cornered animals. Mateo broke first. The terror in his eyes morphed into blind, panicked rage. He stood up, knocking his chair backward. It crashed against the hardwood floor. He pointed a shaking finger directly at Hector. "You told me this would work," Mateo screamed, his voice cracking. "You said the power of attorney was foolproof. You said Amalinda would never check the county records." Hector scrambled to his feet, his face red, trying to shout his son down. "I was trying to save your useless business. You were the one who signed the loan application, Mateo. You submitted the collateral. Do not try to pin this on me. I am not the one who went bankrupt." Mateo lunged forward, slamming his hands onto the dining table. "You forged the notary stamp, Dad. You filed the paperwork. I am not going to federal prison because you are too cheap to hire a real lawyer." The patriarch and the golden child, the two men who had spent their entire lives demanding my compliance, were now screaming obscenities at each other, desperate to assign the blame for a felony they had committed together. Jessica did not yell at Hector. She did not defend her husband. She looked at Mateo with an expression of pure, concentrated disgust. She had married a man she believed was a rising tech entrepreneur. She had curated an entire social media aesthetic around his success, portraying herself as a wealthy executive wife. The realization that her lifestyle was built entirely on fraudulent loans and forged documents destroyed the only value Mateo held for her. "I am not going to jail for you," Jessica hissed. She turned on her heel and sprinted down the hallway toward the Ocean View guest room. I could hear the immediate, frantic sound of closet doors sliding open and hangers clattering against metal. She was packing. The illusion of a supportive marriage had evaporated the second the federal liability transferred to her bank accounts. Carmen reacted exactly as I knew she would. She bypassed the argument between Hector and Mateo entirely. She saw the structural collapse of her family and immediately defaulted to the only strategy she had ever mastered: emotional extortion. She fell back into her chair, pressing her hands against her face, and began to sob. These were not the quiet tears of genuine remorse. They were loud, performative wails designed to center the tragedy entirely on her suffering. She waited for me to approach her to offer comfort, to assume the familiar role of the compliant daughter, soothing the martyr mother. I did not move from my position near the kitchen island. I watched the performance with the cold detachment of a logistics auditor observing a failed structural load test. Carmen lowered her hands, realizing I was not coming to her aid. Her eyes were wide, brimming with weaponized tears. "Amalinda, please," Carmen begged, her voice trembling violently. "Look at what you are doing to us. You are destroying this family over a piece of paper. You have to destroy those documents. You cannot do this to your own brother. He will lose everything." I analyzed her statement, tallying the manipulation like columns on a spreadsheet. In Carmen's worldview, Mateo committing federal wire fraud was simply a mistake. Me gathering the evidence of that fraud was the actual crime. She demanded my complicity to preserve his comfort, asking me to become an accessory after the fact to shield her favorite child from a mandatory minimum sentence. "I did not do anything to him, Mom," I replied calmly, my voice cutting cleanly through the chaotic noise of Hector and Mateo's argument. "I did not forge a signature. I did not file a fake deed. I did not submit a fraudulent loan application to a federal agency. I simply gathered the public paperwork he filed. He destroyed his own business. You are just upset that he cannot steal my house to fix it." Carmen gasped, pressing her hand over her heart as if I had physically struck her. "You are heartless," she whispered. "No," I corrected her. "I am compliant with federal maritime and property laws." I picked up the manila folder from the table. I tapped the edges against the wood, straightening the documents inside before securing the metal clasp. The sharp sound silenced the room. Hector and Mateo stopped yelling. They turned to face me, breathing heavily, their faces drawn and haggard. "Here is the current operational reality," I announced, holding the folder against my side. "You are currently occupying a commercial lodging facility. You are in violation of your payment terms, and you have committed multiple felonies in an attempt to steal the title of this property." I checked the digital clock on the wall. It read 9 o'clock in the evening. "You have exactly 12 hours to pack your belongings and vacate these premises," I stated, my tone unyielding. "If this property is not completely vacant by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, I will forward this entire folder, including the certified port logs, the fake power of attorney, and the asset inspector's business card directly to the Galveston County District Attorney and the Fraud Division of the Small Business Administration." Hector opened his mouth to argue, but the threat of the Federal Fraud Division stopped the words in his throat. "Furthermore," I continued, "if you attempt to damage this property, steal any fixtures, or cause a disturbance while exiting, I will press immediate criminal charges for destruction of commercial property." I turned and walked toward my master bedroom. "Do not test me," I said over my shoulder. "I have the receipts and I have the cameras. Start packing." I walked into my room and locked the heavy wooden door behind me. I set the manila folder on my nightstand. The house outside my door remained quiet for several minutes, the silence heavy with the realization that their extortion attempt had failed spectacularly. Then the frantic sounds of packing began. I heard the heavy thud of suitcases being dragged across hardwood floors. I heard hushed, urgent arguments in the hallway. I heard the front door open and close repeatedly as they began loading boxes into Hector's sedan parked in the driveway. The massive freight truck they had arrived in was long gone, returning to the rental agency. They were forced to abandon the heavy furniture they had brought to claim my space, stuffing only their clothes and personal items into the cramped trunk of a passenger car. I sat on the edge of my bed monitoring the exterior cameras through the application on my phone. The high-definition night vision feed showed Jessica loading a designer suitcase into the back of an Uber. She did not say goodbye to Mateo. She climbed into the back seat, and the car sped away into the dark, leaving him standing alone in the driveway. The hours ticked by. I did not sleep. I maintained my vigilance, knowing that desperate people make unpredictable choices when their options are eliminated. Hector had spent his entire life dominating his environment. He was not a man who surrendered gracefully. He viewed my ultimatum not as a boundary, but as a challenge to his authority. At 10 o'clock, the activity in the hallway ceased. The house grew uncomfortably still. I checked the camera feeds. The living room was empty. The driveway showed Mateo sitting slumped in the passenger seat of Hector's car, his head in his hands. I switched the view to the back deck, the camera overlooking the dark expanse of the Gulf. The infrared lens caught a sudden movement near the sliding glass door. A figure was creeping along the wooden railing, keeping low to avoid casting a shadow into the moonlight. It was Hector. He moved with a stealthy, deliberate caution, completely contradicting the loud, commanding persona he wore during the day. He held a flat, rectangular object tucked tightly under his arm. I zoomed in on the object. The infrared light reflected off the surface, revealing the unmistakable shape of a thick manila folder. Hector's pride had been broken at the dining table, but his ego remained intact. He believed he was outsmarting me one final time. He thought he could sneak out the back door, steal the physical evidence of his crimes, and destroy the paper trail before the morning deadline. He assumed that without the folder, I would have nothing to present to the district attorney. He reached out his hand, grasping the handle of the sliding glass door leading to the exterior staircase. He pulled the handle, preparing to slip away into the coastal night. He was completely unaware that the commercial security system governing the back deck was fully armed. The sliding glass door shifted exactly 1/4 of an inch along its metal track. That tiny physical displacement severed the magnetic contact switch connected to my commercial security mainframe. The siren did not wind up slowly. It erupted instantly. A piercing, high-decibel mechanical shriek designed to disorient warehouse intruders filled the coastal night. Flashing strobe lights mounted under the eaves pulsed bright white, painting the back deck in harsh illumination. Hector froze. His hand remained locked on the brass handle. He squeezed his eyes shut against the blinding light, his shoulders hunched, trapping the thick manila folder tight against his ribcage. He looked like a deer paralyzed by an oncoming freight train. I unlocked my bedroom door and walked down the hallway. I did not rush. I held my phone in my right hand, my thumb resting over the digital keypad application. I reached the living room and flicked on the main overhead lights, flooding the interior space with a warm, steady glow that contrasted sharply with the chaotic strobes outside. I pressed a button on my screen. The siren cut off abruptly. The silence that rushed back in felt heavier than the noise. The strobe lights ceased their flashing. Hector stood outside the glass, breathing hard. He looked through the pane, his eyes meeting mine. His face was a portrait of shattered pride. The patriarch caught sneaking out the back door like a common thief. I reached forward and slid the glass door open. The humid night air washed into the air-conditioned room. "The folder you are holding is a copy Dad I stated." My voice was level, carrying no anger, only the cold presentation of a logistical fact. I printed a duplicate set of the forged documents and left them on the dining table, specifically to see if you would attempt to destroy the evidence. The certified originals are locked in a fireproof safe at Sylvia Garza's law firm in Houston. You just triggered a commercial alarm system to steal printer paper. Hector looked down at the folder wedged under his arm. His jaw worked silently. He had gambled his remaining dignity on a desperate theft and lost. He dropped the cardboard folder onto the wooden deck planks. The printed pages spilled out, scattering across the boards in the sea breeze. "Go to sleep," I instructed, closing the glass door and engaging the deadbolt. "You have to pack your car in the morning." The sun rose over the Gulf, casting long shadows across the driveway. It was 8 o'clock, exactly. The deadline had arrived. My parents and Mateo had spent the night hauling their remaining belongings into my father's sedan. The vehicle sagged under the weight of hastily packed boxes and loose clothing. They lingered in the living room, surrounded by a few remaining bags, drinking my coffee in sullen silence. They were waiting to see if I would actually enforce the ultimatum. In their minds, family always caved at the 11th hour. They did not understand that I had outsourced the final enforcement to individuals who do not possess a familial weak point. The crunch of heavy tires rolling over gravel broke the morning stillness. I walked to the front window. A sleek black SUV pulled to a halt at the edge of my property line. The vehicle bore no markings, but its tinted windows and reinforced suspension indicated a professional transport. The rear passenger door swung open. Sylvia Garza stepped onto the pavement. Sylvia is a corporate litigator who views legal disputes as chess matches played with live ammunition. She wore a tailored charcoal pantsuit and carried a slim leather briefcase. She did not look at the ocean. She walked straight toward my front steps. Behind her SUV, a marked Galveston County Sheriff's Department patrol cruiser pulled in, blocking Hector's sedan from reversing. 2 uniformed deputies exited the vehicle. They adjusted their duty belts, their expressions stoic and alert. They were not arriving to mediate a domestic argument. They were arriving to execute a commercial removal. I opened the front door and stepped onto the porch to meet them. Sylvia offered a curt, professional nod. "Good morning, Amalinda," she said. "I have the injunctions prepared. The officers are fully briefed on the commercial nature of the property." "Thank you, Sylvia," I replied. Hector pushed past me, stepping onto the porch. He puffed out his chest, attempting to project his fading authority toward the approaching law enforcement officers. Carmen and Mateo crowded into the doorway behind him, their faces pale and drawn. "Officers, I am glad you are here," Hector announced, projecting a false confidence. "My daughter is having a mental breakdown and trying to illegally evict her own parents. We are legal residents of this address. I pulled municipal permits yesterday. You need to tell her this is a civil matter and leave us alone." The lead deputy stopped at the bottom of the stairs. He rested his hand on his radio. He did not look impressed by my father's posturing. "Sir, this is a registered commercial lodging facility," the deputy stated firmly. "We have reviewed the municipal zoning records and the corporate deed provided by the property management attorney. You are not a residential tenant. You are a hotel guest who has exceeded the authorized stay and refused to settle the outstanding balance." Hector opened his mouth to argue, but the deputy raised a gloved hand, cutting him off. "Under the Texas Penal Code regarding theft of service, your continued presence on this commercial property without payment constitutes criminal trespass," the officer explained, his tone leaving no room for debate. "This is not a civil tenancy dispute. We are not here to schedule a court date. We are here to remove you from the premises." Sylvia Garza stepped forward. She unlatched her leather briefcase and extracted a crisp, formal document. She handed it directly to Hector. "Mr. Lopez, Sylvia," said her voice sharp and precise. "This is a formal cease and desist order regarding the fraudulent power of attorney you filed with the county clerk. It also serves as official notification that Rosas Retreat LLC is cooperating fully with the district attorney regarding your forged municipal permit application. Any further attempt to encumber this property will result in immediate felony charges." Hector looked at the paper. His hands began to shake. The reality of the law delivered by armed deputies and a ruthless corporate attorney finally pierced his armor of arrogance. He could not yell his way out of a penal code violation. The second deputy checked his watch. "You have exactly 30 minutes to collect the rest of your personal items and vacate this parcel," he instructed. "If you are still standing on this property at 8:30, you will be placed in handcuffs and transported to the county jail for criminal trespass. Do you understand these instructions?" Hector swallowed hard. He nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion. He turned and walked back into the house, his shoulders defeated, his patriarchal reign officially terminated. Mateo remained in the doorway. He looked at Sylvia, then at the deputies, realizing that his forged loan application was sitting in a federal database, ticking like a time bomb. He did not say a single word. He retreated into the house to grab his final duffel bag, a man walking toward an inevitable indictment. The deputies stood by their cruiser, arms crossed, maintaining a silent, imposing overwatch. I remained on the porch with Sylvia. We did not speak. We simply watched the logistics of the removal play out. 20 minutes passed. Hector and Mateo emerged carrying the last of their belongings. They shoved the bags into the back seat of the sedan, the doors barely closing over the disorganized mess. They climbed into the vehicle, refusing to look in my direction. Carmen was the last to exit the house. She did not carry any bags. She walked slowly down the wooden stairs, her eyes fixed on the driveway pavement. She reached the bottom step and stopped. She looked at the marked police cruiser, then looked at the neighbor's house next door. An elderly couple was standing on their balcony, watching the spectacle unfold. Carmen saw an audience. She saw one final opportunity to utilize her favorite weapon. She did not walk to the car. She took 2 steps onto the concrete driveway and let her knees buckle. She collapsed onto the hard pavement, throwing her hands over her face. She let out a loud, piercing wail that echoed down the quiet coastal street. It was a theatrical display of agony designed to shame me into submission, designed to make me the villain in front of the watching neighborhood. She rocked back and forth on the ground, screaming my name, begging for mercy. She had never once offered me. I stood on the elevated wooden deck and looked down at the concrete driveway. The morning sun cast long, hard shadows across the pavement. My mother knelt on the ground, her face buried in her hands, emitting a high-pitched wail that echoed against the neighboring houses. It was a calculated display of agony. Carmen had spent her entire life using public embarrassment as a mechanism for control. She believed that if she created enough spectacle, my instinct to preserve peace would override my boundaries. She assumed I would rush down the stairs, lift her up, and apologize for causing a scene. I did not move. I rested my hands on the wooden railing and watched her performance with the clinical detachment of a port coordinator observing a delayed shipment. Next door, Mr. and Mrs. Gable stepped out onto their second-story balcony. The Gables were retired teachers who kept meticulous gardens. They knew me as the quiet property owner who maintained strict hours and always offered a polite wave. They did not look at me with judgment. They looked at Carmen with profound disdain. The weaponized shame my mother attempted to project onto me was reflecting directly back onto her. She was not a martyr suffering an unjust eviction. She was a trespasser throwing a tantrum on foreign soil. A few feet away from Carmen's theatrical display, the illusion of Mateo Lopez was dissolving into black plastic. My brother had always defined his worth through premium brands and curated aesthetics. His tailored suits and imported shoes were the armor he wore to convince investors he was a visionary. Now that armor was being haphazardly shoved into heavy-duty trash bags. He moved with frantic, jerky motions, tossing silk ties and leather belts onto the driveway before cramming them into the plastic sacks. He was not packing for a move. He was packing for an evasion. Mateo understood the rigid timeline of federal bureaucracy. Marcus Vance, the asset inspector from Sterling Commercial Lending, would finalize his site report over the weekend. By Monday morning, that report would be transmitted to the underwriting department and flagged in the Federal Small Business Administration database. The forged collateral documents would trigger an automated fraud alert. Mateo had 48 hours before his name became synonymous with bank fraud across every financial institution in the country. He grabbed another handful of clothing, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He looked toward the front door, expecting his wife to emerge and help him load the sagging sedan. Jessica did emerge, but she did not carry a trash bag. She rolled 2 large, hard-shell designer suitcases down the porch steps. She wore dark sunglasses and a wide-brimmed hat shielding her face from the morning sun and the judgmental stares of the neighbors. She did not walk toward Hector's car. She walked to the curb. A silver sedan with a rideshare emblem glowing in the windshield pulled up to the edge of my property. The driver popped the trunk. Jessica lifted her luggage, sliding the heavy cases into the vehicle. Mateo dropped the plastic sack he was holding. He took a step toward her, his face twisting into a mask of pure desperation. He called her name, his voice cracking under the weight of his collapsing reality. Jessica did not turn around. She did not offer a comforting word or a promise to call. She opened the passenger door, slid into the back seat, and closed the door with a firm, final thud. The rideshare vehicle accelerated down the street, carrying away the last remnant of Mateo's fabricated life. He stood alone on the concrete, a bankrupt man, watching his wife abandon him to face a federal indictment by himself. The departure of his daughter-in-law finally broke Hector's paralysis. My father had spent the morning watching his authority evaporate, dismantled by municipal codes, commercial attorneys, and armed deputies. He looked at Mateo, who was staring blankly at the empty street. He looked at Carmen, who had stopped wailing when she realized no one was rushing to comfort her. Then Hector looked up at me. He stood near the rear bumper of his overloaded car. His chest heaved with ragged, uneven breaths. The pristine polo shirt he wore was wrinkled, soaked with sweat under the arms. He raised his right hand, extending a shaking index finger toward the elevated deck where I stood. His eyes burned with a toxic mixture of hatred and profound defeat. He needed to deliver one final strike. He needed to assert that he was the one making the choice to sever the bond. "You are no daughter of mine," Hector declared. His voice was hoarse, stripped of its usual booming resonance. It was the ultimate threat in the Lopez family playbook. Disownment. The withdrawal of identity. For decades, I had modified my behavior, suppressed my needs, and managed their liabilities just to avoid hearing those exact words. I had feared the loss of their approval more than I feared my own exhaustion. Hearing the sentence spoken aloud in the humid morning air, I realized it carried no weight. The words were hollow, spoken by a man who had nothing left to leverage. I looked down at the shaking finger, the sweat-stained shirt, and the ruined pride. I offered him a single, slow nod of acknowledgement. "I know, Dad," I replied, my voice steady and clear enough to carry across the driveway. "I am the property manager. Your time is up." The lead deputy stepped off the porch and walked toward the sedan. He rested his hand on his utility belt, a silent reminder of the ticking clock. The 30-minute grace period had expired. "It is time to leave the premises," the officer instructed. He gestured toward the open car doors. Hector lowered his arm. The fight drained out of him, leaving behind the empty shell of an arrogant man. He walked over to Carmen, gripped her elbow, and hauled her up from the concrete. She did not resist. She brushed the dirt from her knees, her face blotchy and devoid of expression, and climbed into the passenger seat. Mateo gathered his trash bags, shoving them into the remaining crevices of the back seat. He squeezed into the cramped space, pulling the door shut. Hector got behind the wheel. The suspension of the sedan groaned under the excessive weight of 3 adults and a haphazard collection of salvaged belongings. He started the engine. He did not look up at the deck again. He shifted the car into gear and pulled away from the curb. The heavy-moving truck they had arrived in just days ago was a distant memory. They drove down the coastal road, 3 individuals bound together by debt failure and impending legal ruin. They had nowhere to go, no assets to liquidate, and 48 hours until the federal authorities began unwinding their fraudulent loan application. The marked police cruiser pulled out behind them, following the sedan until it turned off the main thoroughfare. The driveway was empty. The physical occupation of my sanctuary was officially terminated. I remained on the deck, letting the silence of the morning wash over me. The sound of the Gulf waves crashing against the shoreline filled the space where my parents' chaos used to reside. I heard the distinct click of a briefcase latch opening. Sylvia Garza walked up the wooden stairs, her tailored heels clicking against the planks. She stopped beside me, looking out at the water for a brief moment, before turning her attention back to the logistics of our victory. She held a single, crisp sheet of high bond paper and a silver pen. "The commercial removal is complete," Sylvia stated, her tone retaining its customary professional chill. "However, we have one final administrative vulnerability to close. Given the severity of their fraud and the likelihood of upcoming federal inquiries, we need to insulate your corporate entity and your personal assets from any future legal entanglement." She extended the document toward me. "This is an official revocation of familial contact," Sylvia explained. "It is a legally binding declaration that severs all personal, financial, and administrative ties between you and the Lopez family. It formally registers them as hostile entities to Rosas Retreat, LLC. Once you sign this, any attempt they make to contact you, request financial aid, or approach this property will be classified as targeted harassment and criminal stalking." I looked at the paper. It was the ultimate boundary, the final brick in the wall my Aunt Rosa had told me to build. Sylvia held out the pen. "It is time to cement the perimeter, Amelinda." The dust settled on Saturday morning. I woke up at 6 o'clock without an alarm. The house was quiet. It was not the tense, suffocating quiet of people holding their breath before an argument. It was the deep, resonant silence of an empty structure resting on solid ground. The only sound in the entire house was the rhythmic crashing of the Gulf waves against the wooden pilings beneath the floorboards. I lay in bed for several minutes, simply listening to the water. There were no heavy footsteps in the hallway. There were no hushed, frantic conversations about venture capital or municipal permits filtering through the drywall. The invasion was over. I walked out of my bedroom. I did not have to brace myself for an ambush. I did not have to guard my words or monitor my posture. I walked straight to the garage. The 4 heavy cardboard boxes my mother had packed were sitting exactly where she left them, on the concrete floor. I opened the top carton. I took out my framed nautical charts. I carried them back into the living room, finding the exact nail holes they had previously occupied. I hung them on the wall, centering them with a deliberate, satisfying precision. I returned to the garage and retrieved the woven seagrass baskets, placing them back in the entryway. I unpacked the smooth pieces of driftwood I had collected from the Galveston shoreline. I arranged them on the console table, right where my mother had stood when she stole my utility bills just days prior. Inch by inch, I reclaimed my territory. I walked into the Ocean View guest room. The sterile, hotel-grade sheets I had placed on the mattress to neutralize their comfort were still there. I stripped the bed, tossing the plain white linens into a laundry basket. I carried my thick coastal quilt from the storage closet and draped it over the mattress, smoothing out the wrinkles. I moved the vintage writing desk back from its exile in the garage. I positioned it by the window where the morning light hit the polished mahogany. I erased their physical footprint from the room. I recalibrated the environment. I put my sanctuary back together. I returned to the kitchen island and opened my laptop. The screen illuminated the dark granite counter. I logged into my network administrator portal. The hardware addresses for Mateo's laptop, Carmen's smartphone, and Jessica's tablet were still listed under the restricted bandwidth category. I highlighted all 3 profiles and hit delete. I cleared the router cache, purging their digital presence from my network. Next, I opened the commercial security application. I reviewed the high-definition camera feeds covering the driveway, the living room, the kitchen, and the back deck. The lenses displayed empty spaces. There were no unauthorized personnel trying to sneak out the back door. There were no forged documents resting on the dining table. The perimeter was secure. I sat on the bar stool and looked around the clean, bright room. In my family, conflict was always a theatrical production. Hector and Carmen believed that whoever yelled the loudest, cried the hardest, or inflicted the most guilt was the victor. They measured power by how much emotional damage they could cause. I had spent 34 years believing I had to play a supporting role in their chaotic play. I thought being a good daughter meant standing on the stage and taking the hits so Mateo could shine. I realized this week that peace is not achieved by winning a shouting match. Peace is achieved by refusing to enter the arena entirely. I did not defeat my father by screaming at him on the front porch. I defeated him by checking county tax records and enforcing municipal zoning laws. I did not outsmart my brother by insulting his failed business acumen. I outsmarted him with a biometric access log and a clear understanding of federal underwriting standards. I had executed a flawless logistical defense. I treated their invasion the exact same way I treat a compromised cargo manifest at the port. I audited the variables, isolated the liabilities, established the regulatory boundaries, and closed the account. The single sheet of high bond paper Sylvia Garza had handed me yesterday rested on the kitchen counter. The official revocation of familial contact. My signature was printed in bold black ink at the bottom. That paper was already filed with the legal system. It was a binding declaration. If Hector attempted to drive down my street, a patrol car would intercept him for criminal stalking. If Carmen attempted to call my phone, her number would route to an automated legal warning. If Mateo tried to leverage my name for a plea deal when the federal indictments dropped, my attorney would shut it down before the prosecutor even read the file. The boundary was no longer just a concept in my mind. It was a recorded legal instrument. I thought about where they were this morning. Hector and Carmen were homeless. Their life savings surrendered to a bankruptcy court, driving a severely overloaded sedan with no destination. Mateo was waking up in a cheap motel, waiting for the automated fraud alert to flag his name in the federal banking database. Jessica was already gone, severing her ties to a sinking ship. They were facing the catastrophic consequences of their own choices. For the first time, I was not expected to fix it. I walked into my home office. The room was exactly as I had left it before Jessica ordered the movers to clear it out. Resting on the corner of my desk was a small silver frame containing a photograph of my Aunt Rosa. It was taken a few years before she died. She was sitting on a porch, holding a cup of tea, looking directly at the camera with a knowing, unbothered smile. I picked up the silver frame. Rosa did not just leave me the financial capital to purchase a beach house. The money was merely a tool. The real inheritance was the instruction she left with it. Buy a door they cannot unhinge. She understood my parents better than anyone. She knew they would always view me as a resource to be harvested. She knew they would try to break my spirit to fund Mateo's delusions. By instructing me to protect the asset, Rosa left me the blueprint for my own independence. She gave me permission to build a fortress. She taught me that true safety requires more than physical distance. It requires structural integrity. If I had purchased this house in my own name, Hector would have successfully claimed residential tenancy. Mateo would have successfully pledged the collateral. I would have been dragged into a federal wire fraud conspiracy simply because my name was on the deed. Rosa's foresight saved my career and my freedom. I set the frame back on the desk. I walked to the kitchen and filled the coffee maker with fresh grounds. The machine hissed and sputtered, the rich aroma of roasted coffee filling the open room. I poured a hot cup into a ceramic mug and carried it to the sliding glass door. I unlocked the heavy steel deadbolt. I slid the thick glass open and stepped out onto the wraparound wooden deck. The morning air was cool, thick with the sharp scent of salt and damp sand. The sun was just breaking over the vast horizon of the Gulf of Mexico. It painted the water in brilliant, shifting shades of gold and deep orange. A pair of pelicans glided low over the surf, riding the coastal wind with effortless grace. I walked to the edge of the deck and leaned against the sturdy wooden railing. The wood felt warm under my hands. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the clean ocean air. I let the breath out slowly, feeling the tension drain from my shoulders. I was not anticipating the next crisis. I was not bracing for a phone call demanding my money, my time, or my submission. I did not have to manage Hector's fragile ego or Carmen's weaponized grief. The threat had been neutralized and removed from the premises. The boundary was drawn in ink and recorded in the county files. The load path was secure, bearing only the weight I chose to place upon it. The door remained firmly on its hinges. This house and the life I was building inside it finally belonged to me alone.